So that's a quick overview of the topic. I do want to get into our discussion questions because these will open up some new issues that we haven't talked about so far in the class. So let me share those, which I should have open here. There we are.
Yeah, they're up there.
Yeah, they're up there too.
I can read those better than these.
Okay. So the first one is, what were strengths of previous forms of Jewish political power, like the monarchy, priesthood, the democracy system, and what were their weaknesses? So what are some of the strengths of a monarchy or a priestly theocracy?
Well, I mean, it's not just Jewish. I think this runs throughout any
Sure.
group, you know. I mean, the problem with the judges was that they didn't necessarily take decisive action on things because they're trying to decide, and they've got too many leaders trying to figure out what to do, and the people who are the elders or the judges aren't necessarily the best people for those roles. On the other hand, but the strength of it is that the people have more influence, and that you're not going to have a judge who is a tyrant, because that's not built into the system.
So sometimes having one person in charge means you know where the buck stops, right? There's a clear authority who's in charge. I'm sorry.
It can be unifying things too. I mean,
right.
You know, everybody's loyal to the king.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, small village societies with groups of elders work fine.
Sure.
Which is sort of the same thing as what it sounds like the judges are.
Most of the time, but what I found in my own research, because these are stateless, what I call stateless societies, and when we talk about Africa, was that when there was a major stress, such as a European colonialism coming in, that very often the stateless society broke down and a leader arose, you know, who sort of took charge and tried to do something, not successfully usually against the Europeans, but that was this is how states often arise, is that it's in response to something else. Right. But that's not the only reason that states arise. Sometimes it's internal.
Yep.
But okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, I'd also point out that when you have either it's a priestly rule or rabbinic rule under a theocracy or even a monarchy, you have limited changes. There's sort of a consistent tradition of how it goes on from father to son, and they endorse the laws of the one before, and you know, there's a sort of stability there that you know, people are all eager for revolution, but the guillotines are hungry, you know, and it doesn't always turn out the way you want it. Right, as Robespierre himself discovered.
Well, the advantages to a monarchy is when you have, you know, Selim the Grim or Suleiman the Magnificent, it's wonderful. But when you have, you know, when you have Richard II,
that's on the weaknesses side,
but
right?
His son might be an idiot. I mean,
and he's often an idiot.
And he's often an idiot. Right. In fact, it's not unusual.
That was the amazing part about Philip of Macedon and Alexander. You actually had two brilliant kings in a row.
And you sometimes you have that, and you, like, we had a series of sort of brilliant popes, you know, from 1000 to like 1200, but then.
Well, you know, brilliant depends on your perspective. It's also crusading era too.
Yeah, right. But I mean, in terms of stronger leadership,
from the Jews in Europe's perspective, it wasn't so good.
No, that's true. But you have a Charlemagne, and then you have his sons.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and Alan points out also, small societies don't always work out well. Look at condo boards and how those tend to work. So
well, and you know, just taking reenacting groups. You know, almost inevitably they hive off because there's one group that wants to do this and the other group does as opposed to that, and then it breaks apart.
Right.
And that's
so if you had a monarch of the reenactors, like, maybe it would keep together, maybe not.
So in Africa, we had, when we doing our research, there was sort of an apocryphal story, like, you know, why is there this clan here and this clan here? And it's always like, well, they were two brothers and they fought over something.
Right.
And you know, it's there was a classic story that one of my professors told me, who had worked in Ghana, you know, and he said, you know, there's a Charlestown and there's, what was the other one? Williamstown, Williamstown, and in Ghana, you know, named after English kings. And one time he sort of asked one of his, you know, informants, like, well, why are there these two towns? He says, well, there were these two brothers, Charles and William, and they, you know, and they had a dispute, and so they were, you know, but that's how you explain how these things happen. But that's part of it. Even in smaller societies, you end up with these factions.
Right. Now, I will also point out that in historic Jewish governance, there wasn't a separation of religion and government. And maybe that was a strength, because you get a divine endorsement of the ruling power, be it a king, or even the prophets were seen as chosen by the Hebrew God Yahweh. And certainly when you have priests in charge, there's no rival authority or source for division in that sense.
But you have.
And one last strength to that is, if you do have rules on society, they have divine authority behind them.
Right.
So it's not just like, well, the king happened to say you should bring the sacrifices or you should observe these dietary laws. The God said this, and it's the same God that's in charge, even if they're the next high priest, the next high priest after them, or the next rabbi, and the next rabbi after them. So, and it also produces a kind of social enforcement of these cultural norms and community norms,
Right.
that has the authority of God and the eyes and ears of all your neighbors to make it work.
Religion tends to do that. It's used as, the ancestors or whatever you want to use. It sanctifies the order of society.
Right.
But the difficulty is that when society is unjust, it's difficult to break that through.
Look, there are plenty of weaknesses, right?
Yeah, no,
there are plenty of weaknesses to this system. Any variation on theocracy is unresponsive to individual rights and impedes cultural development and evolution and social innovation.
Well, also when you have, you see this even in the like kings and stuff. You start to realize you have groups that are not Jewish or not Hebrews within the Judea, for example, and now they're sort of like in this undigestible nut.
Right.
Like what do we do with these people? The strangers have to do this, and that becomes a problem too.
Well, and look,
Israel, like today, is the same issue.
Yeah. Any system that's modeled on the elite ruling as opposed to being responsive to the people has its deficits. I'd also point out that if you put all your eggs into a centralized leadership, that's risky.
Yeah.
Look what happened to the kings, right?
Yeah.
They wipe out the king's kids. The one king gets eyes taken out, and he's gone. And what are you supposed to do here? The Jerusalem temple was the center of the priestly theocracy under the Torah, which worked fine until the Jerusalem temple gets destroyed, and then their power base is gone, their claim to authority is gone, and then the rabbis are able to take over afterwards. So, you put all your eggs in one basket is a problem, and ultimately, the rabbinic authority that did last to some extent in a stable fashion from the first few centuries of the Common Era. That's what I want to say. First few centuries of the Common Era is the real establishment of rabbinic authority. It lasts all the way till the dawn of the Enlightenment and the beginning of emancipation. And once Jews begin to be emancipated and actually have choices, then they start to choose to do different things. But the model of rabbinic Judaism lasted for a long time until Jews had other options.
Wasn't that partially because it was very decentralized still? I mean, each group sort of had their own leader. There wasn't anyone that...
Right. Well, you had a central body of literature, the Talmud, that defined Jewish law and sort of a chain of rabbinic teaching.
I mean, they interpreted it different, I assume.
Yes, but you generally had sort of in Eastern Europe, they had a yeshiva system, which was like a university system for rabbis. And you would be trained in a particular yeshiva, and then you go out to a local community, and you had some authority to make interpretations, but you couldn't declare pig kosher. Right? Like there were limits on what you could do, but if you had a particularly challenging case you couldn't decide, you might go back to your yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, and ask him what his interpretation would be. For a long time in Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, there was something called the Council of the Four Lands. Lasted for 300 or 400 years, and it was not only an economic and political association of Jews to represent them to other ruling powers. This is under the Polish-Lithuanian Empire in that period, but it also was a rabbinic confab. That they could gather authorities and come to consensus on certain issues and make decisions. It is true that Jewish law is a decentralized phenomenon. Even today, there are multiple Orthodox sects that don't always agree on what other Orthodox sects have ruled allowed or not. Do they accept the Eruv that's been put up by one group or not, that defines a space you can carry things on Shabbat? Do they accept the kosher standards of one group or another group? They might be more stringent on how it's slaughtered or how it's not slaughtered. Again, none of them are going to agree to pork being kosher, but Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews disagreed on whether corn and, they all agree corn is not, but on whether beans and rice are allowed on Passover. So they all agree corn is not, it's too close to a grain and has water in it, therefore could leaven. But Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews can eat rice and beans during Passover, where Ashkenazi Jews historically could not. And there's a whole school of thought behind that.
No,
but that's
I did mention that once before, actually.
In the earlier class.
That
but that's a case where they're both Orthodox, but they've taken different legal rulings on
Right.
certain cases,
Well,
more stringent or less.
That happens in the Islamic world too. You have the North African Qadis, and it's different from the Zanzibari. But I have one question. How the rabbinic system seems to be impacted in my mind by the fact that Jews never controlled their own destinies in the sense of any state post-temple, the Second Temple destruction until Israel. So
other than the Maccabean state, there was the Hasmoneans had a
what I mean is, but
150
after
years.
70 AD, pretty much.
Yeah, for sure.
In the Common Era. I mean, so the rabbis, in a sense, are filling a vacuum, because if there had been like the Muslims had a caliphate, the Abbasids or whatever, it might have developed differently. But it seems that, as Kathy was saying, the dispersion of Jews amongst wide areas and the fact that they're sort of guests within these states in a lot of ways.
And in many cases, I mean, the other exception is there was a 3-4 year period under the Bar Kokhba revolt where they minted their own coins and had some independence. But it's a blip. It's a blip in history. But yes, by and large, Jews lived as guests in other societies, and that's how they saw themselves too.
Yeah.
They didn't see themselves as French or Europe or Polish. They were Jews living in Poland until the modern period when they could integrate. But they had collective rights of residence. They didn't have individual citizenship. It was the Jewish community of this town that worked out a deal with the local lord or the town authorities, and that gave them the right to stay for paying a certain tax and living in certain conditions, and it was all collective rights. And so they saw themselves as a collective governing themselves by Jewish law. In fact, it would be radical to go to the non-Jewish courts in a particular lawsuit. You would generally do it within the Jewish court system. In fact, there's a woman who's one of our heroines for doing this. Her name was Ernestine Rose. She was the daughter of a rabbi, and the rabbi wanted her to marry someone that she didn't want to marry. So she rented a horse and wagon and rode to Polish court and sued him there to get him to stop. But think about the daughter of the rabbi in 18 teens going to sue her father in Polish court under the Russian Empire. I mean, unheard of. And she winds up leaving him and going off to England. She becomes a feminist and an abolitionist and an atheist and an outspoken critic of religion. And she's a really wonderful character. But she starts with this radical move of going beyond the Jewish community to try to get justice.
What I was trying to get at was do you think that the rabbinic system is in effect assisted in sort of being in this controlling situation that they might not have been had there been states controlled by Jews?
Yes. Well, yes and no. It depended what kind of state. If it was a theocracy state where the rabbis made decisions on key issues. And Israel itself today is mostly democratic with some theocratic elements. So deciding the tax rates, rabbis, other than people elected to the parliament, as any party is, there's no particular religious authority over that. Who gets to be a Jewish citizen, who gets to get buried in a Jewish cemetery, there you have Orthodox authorities that are in charge of that. But laws of politics, laws of like voting rights and so on, those are determined by political issues and the body of case law and the way democracies work. So Israel is a flawed democracy, like other flawed democracies. And in some cases, religion has too much authority, and in other cases, it doesn't. Israel was one of the first countries to recognize gay marriages from other countries. It was one of the first Western countries to allow gays in the military. When the U.S. put in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it was around the same time Israel was allowing gays to serve openly in their military. So in some ways, it's progressive on those kind of metrics. And it's not a theocracy, but in other cases, it's more so. In fact, one of the dilemmas in dealing with Hamas and other fundamentalist Muslim organizations is they imagine that rabbis run Israel, just like they would want imams to run their society, so they project it onto the Jews, and it's just not arguing with rabbis, disagreeing with rabbis is itself a Jewish tradition that goes back quite a long time. The medieval rabbis in Spain are complaining about people not observing Shabbat. It goes back a long time in Jewish life. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. Why is democracy more compatible with secular humanistic Judaism than other political systems? So why is democracy a good fit for our philosophy?
Well, it fits into our value systems, I think. In terms of individual freedoms and promoting good causes and things, it seems to,
We accept that laws can change.
Yeah.
Right? Culture changes over time. We give the individual the dignity of being part of determining laws and making decisions. As we said, it supports individual freedom. Look, humanistic Judaism would not exist in a non-democracy, because you'd have a central authority that's decreeing what religion needs to be, whether it's a Christian state or just one with an official. I mean, it's even hard to do in England, where they have a chief rabbi who controls the budgets for all the Jewish communities. So you have to get acceptance by an Orthodox chief rabbi to be able to fund your synagogue. I mean, it's just a different model, and it would be harder for us to do there. Although, of course, England is a democracy, but it's a different style than the American democracy. In theory, we are not treating people differently. The rich, the nobles, every voice counts the same, and this also affirms equal human dignity. Again, this is in theory. Having no established church is a big deal. It enables freedom of conscience and freedom of association and full participation in government. Remember, England, as democratic as it was post Magna Carta, post Cromwell Revolution, Catholics couldn't serve in the government because of the oath of office until the early 1800s, and Jews couldn't serve until the 1870s because they were required to swear an oath as a Christian, and they wouldn't do that. So, what's full emancipation mean? Well, sometimes it takes time in different states. In the U.S., Jews could vote in federal elections from the adoption of the Constitution. They couldn't vote in Maryland state elections until the 1820s, just because Maryland required a Christian vote.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And most importantly, protecting minority viewpoints is good for us on multiple levels.
Right.
It's good as Jews, it's good as humanists. We can really benefit
the majority,
from that.
So we don't want the
no matter how you slice it, we're going to be in the minority.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So now number 3, what are some of the failings of democracy as it has developed in human experience?
Well, I think we've gone over a lot.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that.
I mean, one of the things is that
money and lobbying.
Yeah, and you can get if you control who votes, through poll taxes and literacy laws and things, you can actually subvert the democracy fairly easily if people allow. Yeah, well, Huey Long. I mean, there's lots of cases of that. And we see it right now, that's been going on.
And you can also have the tyranny of the supermajority.
Well,
if you're the atheist living in a town that's all fundamentalist Christians, they're going to want to pray in schools, and they're going to want to do things that you have very little recourse to address.
Yeah, I mean, part of the point of the constitutional democracy that we have is that the minority rights get protected, and that's what the courts are supposed to be doing, and not just allowing the majority to rule. But it's a very difficult line, because sometimes the court turns around and tries to protect minorities in ways that are shoving their views on everybody else, which we're seeing with Roe versus Wade.
Well, you also get the challenge of who actually shows up to vote. All too often the winner in the election is none of the above, because
we don't get 50%.
30% of the possible voters voted for one candidate, and 28% of the possible voters voted for the other candidate, which means that 42% of the possible voters didn't show up.
Right, no, that's right.
And then you get people who run elections on purpose to try to get fewer people to vote, like the Chicago mayoral election, which is run in the winter on an off year, and an odd year, intentionally, so that the ward bosses can get their people to show up to vote, and it doesn't get a mass turnout. So, this is one of those challenges of who sets the rules and who sets the voting and how many people actually show up. Democracy in theory is great, but all too often the people that aren't voting are having an impact too, and they're allowed not to vote. Although in some democracies,
everybody has to vote.
In Australia you get a fine if you don't vote. Right. I've actually heard another interesting theory.
In New Zealand.
Is if you had a voting lottery where every 1,000th voter randomly chosen gets $100. That might get more people to vote. And you're not bribing them, because you're not choosing, who's getting the money based on what they vote. It's just a randomly selected certain number of voters get a prize. And, you would get much higher turnout if you had something like that. So, anyways, there are other ways to get more people to vote, but the fact that not enough people vote is a failing of democracy.
And, when you have 12 candidates running and, somebody wins with 18%, it's
right, exactly. Also, sometimes there's a limited choice of government representatives. You know, people are trying to address this with ranked choice voting, where in theory you could have a minority party candidate that becomes a second choice of other people and then moves up the ladder.
The other problem is that most of us can't afford to run.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if I wanted to run for governor of Illinois, how am I going to do that?
Right.
You know,
exactly.
Unless I can get Peter Uihlein to give me a bunch of money or something.
Well, you also have the dilemma of local versus national interest. You know, how do you allocate resources? Now, it might be the case that one town has a much greater need than another town. But if they have an influential senator or a representative with seniority,
right,
the less needy town might get it. Or, you know, making decisions that aren't good for your community but are good for the nation as a whole, that's a tough sell when you got to go back to your local people and explain to them why it's going to turn out that way. So there's vested interest with the corn lobby and ethanol production and all these issues. So here's the exact Winston Churchill quote. "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. It has been said democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Okay. So we talk a little bit about some of the statements in the book on reproductive choice, separation of church and state, social action. How do they connect with our philosophy and how might they be critiqued by it? In general, they emphasize the power of the individual to control their own life. They balance government needs with individual rights. They talk about public policy based on reason and science rather than faith or theology. Public space and public schools should be secular. They often draw on Jewish roots. We saw with the social action statement that talks about Jewish history and the Jewish historical experience. And if we don't believe in God's intervening in the world, then we're the ones that have to make the changes to fix it. And I especially like that it defends the rights of all peoples, not just Jews. You know, that we have a common cause with other minorities and other people who face oppression. Now, where would we critique this? Well, there's one part that I found a little problematic because it said the problem that we do not support any vouchers that would go to any private schools whatsoever because it undermines support in public schools. And I thought to myself, well, is it a core tenet of our philosophy that you have to go to a public school? Or that you have to support public schools? I can imagine a secular person who likes the idea of private schools. In fact, in New York State, in the 1840s, they had an idea for an alternate way to run schooling. Instead of running secular public schools, they would give every person a voucher, basically, that they could use to go to the school of their choice. And so then the government is equally supporting whatever education you choose. And if you want to send your kid to a Catholic school, you could do that. If you want to send them to a Protestant school, you could do that. If you want to send them to a new secular school that would develop, you could do that. And people would make their own choices, and that would be government-neutral approach to funding schooling. Philadelphia also talked about a system like this at one time.
But expensive.
Well, it's expensive, but on the other hand, you're not running a public school system. You know, you're just giving direct support to people to make, it's like universal basic income, but for education.
Yeah, but giving me a voucher doesn't do much good if there's no school available to go to. I mean,
it works in New York City, it works in Philadelphia, where you have a critical mass of options.
Richland.
No,
right, in small towns it might work.
Right, yeah.
On the other hand, a lot of those small towns, at least in the 1840s, were very monolithic in terms of the ethnic and religious groups that were there. You know,
no, not just in the 1840s.
Right, into the 1940s.
Into the, I mean,
2040s.
her town right now, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, I don't believe there's any Jews or black people that live in Richland.
Our minorities are Lutherans.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right. All right, so, but the point is that just because the way we run it now is X doesn't mean it always had to be X or that it's necessarily the only way to understand it. I also noticed that sometimes they don't fully take advantage of Jewish sources. For example, the social action statement never uses the phrase tikkun olam, repair the world, that you see now in a lot of this religious left activism. That could have been used. It wouldn't undermine the value of the statement to use some of those traditional phrasings or even Hebrew language. They also say that any religious symbol in a public square is necessarily a violation. And the challenge with that is that the direction the Supreme Court has gone in the last several years has been to say all of the above instead of none of the above. You know, if you create a public forum with a Christmas tree or a nativity scene, you have to allow other religious perspectives to be there, including atheism, as part of that spectrum of religious belief and behavior. So all of the above could also work. It doesn't have to always be none of the above. Plus, where do you draw the line on cultural versus religious? There are a lot of people who see a Christmas tree as a cultural symbol. And they do it not because of the virgin birth. They do it because this is the winter holiday, and this is what people have always done.
I was brought up with a Christmas tree, you know, and it was never a religious symbol in my house. It was simply a symbol of the season.
Right.
You know?
It never was in our house either.
Yeah.
And so, you know, for some people, the menorah is a symbol of the miracle of the lights, and for other people, this is what Jews do. We light candles, it's dark out, you know?
Yeah, well, I like
Makes
candles
sense.
because it's my cultural heritage.
Right.
And so I do both things because both are part of my cultural heritage.
So drawing those lines is not always as clean as
They're
we
not religious in
might think. Right.
Yeah. I think that's particularly true with Jewish culture because it's kind of gotten defined that way in a way, much more so than you don't talk about Christian culture per se.
Well, it's interesting, when I meet with wedding couples and I describe humanistic Judaism to them and what it means to be a cultural Jew, often the non-Jewish partner will say, yeah, that's sort of how I connect to Christianity. It's the Easter eggs, it's not the passion story. It's the Christmas tree, it's not the nativity scene. It's a cultural inheritance. It's a religious heritage is another phrase they might use. I'm not actively religiously Christian, but I have a Christian religious heritage or inheritance, and that defines how they connect to it. Or it's a mix, you know, if they have like a strong ethnic Christian heritage, like Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic, then the line between Italian and Catholic and cultural Christianity is not that, you know, not that easy to draw. So this next one, number 5, is an interesting challenge. How could one articulate a defensive affirmative action from the perspective of secular humanistic Judaism? And how could you articulate an attack on affirmative action from the perspective of secular humanistic Judaism? So start with the easier one. How might you defend the need for affirmative action?
Well, I mean, we would posit affirmative action as a remedy for historical wrongs.
Okay. And also correcting for current social bias.
Yeah.
Right? Think about the job applications with stereotypically black names that get half the interviews of the same applications with the same statistics and resumes and recommendation letters as so-called white names. We also would make the argument that a diversity of human experiences is good for the learning environment. You know, you want to have different socioeconomic experiences, different ethnic and cultural experiences, and a diverse campus community can be good for people to learn about other groups beyond their own experience. We also might say that at times the social good outweighs individual rights or meritocracy. That the social good of enabling people to get that step up, to make up for past wrongs, or to create some kind of equity and access, is worth the fact that somebody with the same test score might not get in because they're not from a previously unprivileged background.
You know, like I said, you have systemic racism or prejudice that's built into the system.
Right.
In order to break that down, you have to, in fact, set the pendulum in the other direction for a while in order to equal it out, to get to the point where hopefully you're not using those measuring sticks anymore, but people have equal rights to get in. But the problem is that structurally, elementary schools and secondary schools suck in certain areas and not in other areas, and a lot of that's racially based.
So often people will talk about equality of access versus equality of result, or equal opportunity versus equal results. And some are satisfied with equal opportunity, and that's, you know, everybody gets a chance to apply, and that's enough. And they don't like the idea of equal results where you impose some kind of balancing on this. The problem is that unless you have some minimal baseline of equality of results, you don't have equal opportunity. If you don't have access to a SAT tutor, then that's going to be a limit on, you know, on your opportunity. It's not a pure meritocracy.
Right. Sometimes kids from bad high schools have a really tough time in college because they haven't
just
been
not
trained
prepared.
to study.
Right. Well, so
kind of stuff.
here's where we can start to flip the script here and think about what might be some problems with affirmative action from our perspective. And one of them might be that realistic assessment that sometimes it doesn't work well. You know, you want to create a diverse campus, and what do you get? You get people self-segregating into, you know, ethnic houses and fraternities and even tables at lunches. You know, you look at the racial distribution of where people choose, and a free cafeteria. They can sit anywhere they want. And people tend to self-segregate by ethnic and religious groups.
Why is that a criticism of affirmative action?
Well, I mean, because the claim of affirmative action was that by admitting a diverse population, you're creating a diverse experience on campus for the students that are there, but it hasn't necessarily worked out that way.
Okay, I can see that, but I don't Yeah, but I'm not sure that I see that because people individually decide to thwart the idea that that necessarily makes the idea bad.
Well, I didn't say it was bad, it just didn't work the way it was intended. If the goal is to create a diverse environment, to get people to experience people with different backgrounds, and they don't do that, then you didn't succeed in the goal.
Yeah, well, to me, that would be a very minor goal. To me, it's getting the opportunity for black kids to get into Northwestern so they get an quality education instead of having to go to the school that isn't so good because, I mean, to me, that's the more important goal rather than the diversity aspect.
So here's another evidence-based response or experience-based response. Having an affirmative action system in place might create an assumption or even a resentment of unfair treatment. So a majority population sees a minority population on campus and assumes they're there only because of affirmative action, which may not at all be true.
But that's exactly what one of the senators said to Kenji Brown, you know.
Right.
It implied that she was only there because she was.
Right, exactly. And look, it's one of the reasons why Clarence Thomas objects to affirmative action.
Even though he benefited by it.
He benefited by it, but he hated the fact that people assumed he was there because of it. I mean, he came from you want to talk about poor, underprivileged background, he absolutely did.
But that's not the fault of affirmative action, it's the fault of people's attitudes.
Well,
affirmative action, it doesn't say anything about changing people's attitudes.
I think the goal is that in the long run, you want to change people's attitudes so that you don't need the system in place anymore. And if the result of the system in place is reinforcing those attitudes of they don't deserve to be here, then you're not achieving your goal.
See, I would disagree with that to some degree. I mean, because I don't think that the goal of it is changing people's attitudes. The goal of it is changing the structure underneath it so that people have an opportunity to get the higher level of education, which may result in a change of attitudes at some point.
Yeah.
But that to me is not the major goal.
Reason that you say.
Okay.
You don't say go
I
to
guess we just have
Harvard
a
so that
different-
you can change everybody's attitude to.
Well, I think part of the goal was that you wanted people to accept diversity. So, you know, as Judge Roberts said, the ultimate goal of stopping discrimination on the basis of race is to not discriminate on the basis of race, and that would be something that people choose to do.
I don't disagree with that. It's just, I think we're just emphasizing different parts of it. That's all.
So Alan offers another couple ideas. How long is it going to last? Like, when are you done?
Well, that's true.
What's the finish line look like?
Yeah, what's the finish line look like?
You know, and also this is the question of qualification. There is something to be said for saying that you're privileging a certain individual over another individual, and if we want to treat people the same with equal rights and dignity, then that is a sacrifice in an affirmative action system that's benefiting certain people at the expense of other people.
Right,
with limited admissions. That's going to be the case.
But it's like having 200 years of oppression for black people, and then white people cry like, "Oh my God! For the last 10 years, they've been getting benefited." I mean, to me,
Look,
that's just outweighs it.
Remember, we're articulating possible arguments. This is my debate team experience where you have to see both sides of the side.
This is why I'm a lousy debater.
This is interfering with a strictly individual judgment. You know, you're rewarding or penalizing somebody for earlier academic success or failure. And it does judge members of different ethnic groups differently.
Sure.
And the last piece I'd bring in is that there is a Jewish experience of the quota system working against them. In the 1930s to the 1960s, Ivy League schools actually had quotas of Jews to keep them out.
My father was
from
one
that.
of the top kids in his class at Boys High, and his dream was to go to Columbia College. And at Columbia College said, "Thanks a lot, we have enough Jews this year."
Right.
I mean, he went to Brooklyn College for a year. I mean, precisely, he was excluded from Columbia precisely for that reason.
Right. So, you know, a system of rigid quotas based on population groups doesn't always work out to Jewish benefit. There's a reason why
Northwestern excluded, I mean, had strict quotas.
And there's a reason why the plaintiffs in the Harvard affirmative action case are Asian Americans who could make the argument that they've been excluded. Look what happened to the University of California school system.
Yeah.
The University of California school system now, the elite colleges have a much higher percentage of Asian students than they did before when they had an affirmative action system in place. Now, there are other ways to meet similar goals. So, for example, I believe in Texas, but also I believe in California, if you're in a certain percentage of your class, you're guaranteed admission to some state school. So if you're in the top 25% of your class.
They do that in Ohio.
Okay.
And Ohio State actually has to take certain number of kids, and unfortunately it results in a huge dropout rate, flunk out dropout rate, because they're taking kids from rural schools in Ohio that aren't that good.
Right. Well, and it's sort of a backdoor goal of racial equity where you say the top 25% of any school, whatever the school is, even if it's not a great school, top 25%, you get the access opportunity to see what you can do with it. And a similar thing happened when Biden was proposing student loan forgiveness. By emphasizing Pell Grants, it was a backdoor route to helping African American and Latino students who have a higher proportion of their students getting those particular style of grants, even though they are race blind, they're need based, and so it's another way to address the historic issue. So there are other strategies that may not be as sort of mechanical or clumsy as affirmative action that might still accomplish some of the same goals. So the last question we talked about a bit at the end: how do you reconcile different approaches to social action among its members? Again, you want to find non-controversial opportunities to work together, and you don't have to agree with 100% of something a group does. And maybe it's worth saying sometimes, for me, Humanistic Judaism suggests I should do this thing, as opposed to the Pope says, Humanistic Judaism says you must be a vegan, or you must advocate for physician-assisted suicide, not just a death thing that you want. And so you present these community service opportunities as opportunities to do good, rather than something you have to do, and hopefully people make the choice to help other people as it motivates them.